Growing up for me was really, really difficult, and there's lots of things that happened. I grew up without a dad. My mum, she had her own problems and struggles bringing me up, and I found myself in care a couple of times, once when I was 2, another time when I was 6. And I ended up going to different schools because of that number of different primary schools, 4 different primary schools. And when I was about 10 or 11, I moved back in with my mum at the time, but I found myself really unhappy, and I had this strong sense of wanting to belong and be accepted by my friends. I lacked a lot of confidence. I didn't have any self-esteem, and I began to act out. I began to become naughty. I began to be really disruptive and just verbally not a nice person. And I began to steal fags from my mum, steal money from my mum, and at the time, this was around the rave scene, when the rave scene was kicking off, and I remember wanting to be accepted by my peers, and this is when I started getting to taking drugs. Academically, I showed a lot of promise in primary school. I passed the 11 plus. I went to grammar school, but this was around the time my problems really started to kick in. I was really unhappy at home. I really wanted to be accepted. So the only way I felt I could be accepted by my peer group was by acting out, being the bad boy, in the way I thought a bad boy was, kind of thing, you know. So I ended up just getting in trouble with the police a lot. I was always in and out of juvenile court. I was always very disruptive in class, to the point where I would smash things up and just be really, really disruptive. As a consequence of that, I always found myself in detention. And when I think back to my secondary school years, you know, I was always, my strongest memories always tell me that I was either in detention or in suspension or permanently excluded. Over the years, I got permanently excluded from 4 different schools. I just could not settle down. And alongside of all that, I always remember having a strong memory of a lot of professionals intervening in my life, from drug counsellors through to the probation service, through to youth justice services, through to education welfare, through to behavioural therapists, which I experienced inside of school and outside of school. So my school life was just completely chaotic and complete upheaval. After being excluded from the 3rd school in my local area, no other school in the area would accept me, so I ended up having to go to a boarding school. I was given a chance to move down a year to try and catch up academically, because by this time I'd fallen behind academically. I refused that opportunity, and I ended up finishing my secondary school years, leaving with no qualifications. I'd been expelled from the boarding school before I had a chance to take my GCSEs. And so I moved back in with my mum, and by this time I was just completely in the throes of taking lots of drugs, mainly cannabis and ecstasy, and I was completely lost. My sister at the time was 6 years old, and my mum threw me out when I was 17, and this experience of being thrown out at 17 made me homeless for the first time, and the local authorities managed to house me, but I was housed in this block of flats. And for the first time ever in my life, you know, I was a young boy in this adult environment, and I was surrounded by many people who, like me, were suffering from various inflictions, from chronic amphetamine dependency, from chronic alcoholism, chronic heroin addiction, people who just come out of prison. So there's a whole plethora of mix of people, you know, and it's a really dangerous and volatile and unpredictable environment. So here I am, a young boy, having had all the experience I've had, being thrust into this adult environment where there's lots of unpredictability and violence and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And it was an uncomfortable space. I ended up racking up a load of rent arrears, and I ended up getting evicted from there. So again, I was made homeless. And I was picked up by the police because I was no fixed abode, and because I was already on bail for a couple of things. I got sent to prison, got sent to young offenders. And this was the first time I'd experienced my liberty being taken away from me. And there's some real fear, some anxiety around, wow, you know, if I continue as I am doing, you know, there's risk, there's a good chance I could have my liberty being taken away from me on a permanent basis almost. And that made me really take stock and think about how I was behaving. I ended up being sentenced, and as part of my sentence I had a community sentence. So instead of returning to young offenders, I had a community sentence where I had to stay in a bail hostel for 6 months. And again, this was another environment where there was lots of drugs, lots of heroin, lots of crack, lots of violence, but somehow I managed to thrive in that environment. I came to terms with the fact that I need to make some changes, and so I managed to stop the drugs and stop my criminal ways. However, this is when my gambling came to surface and became a really, really big problem for me. When I left the bail hostel, I moved into this shared housing place, which was okay, but my gambling really began to accelerate. And I decided, after a few months, I wanted to build a relationship up with my dad. I'd previously met my dad a couple of years previous, before my mum threw me out at 16 on Grand National Day of all days. And thinking about that experience, I'd always reflect on that experience, and I always wonder what influence that had on my relationship with gambling. Because to meet my dad was a really big dream come true. I was over the moon, I was overjoyed. I've met my dad. I can have a chance to meet my dad and build a real strong relationship, father and son relationship. But that was my dream, that was my fantasy. I remember that day we sat down, my dad, my mum, myself, and we watched the race. The horse that my dad had placed a bet on had won, and he gave me some money. So that experience for me was really quite significant, really symbolic as well, I think. So moving forwards, I'm in this shared house, and I'm talking to my dad, and I want to build a relationship up with him. And so I decide to move to where he's living at the time. So I moved to the town where he's living, and I set up shop. I find a job. I'm living in the same town as my dad. It was a wonderful experience, but my gambling really began to really worsen and develop. I didn't really get a sense of it worsening and developing because I was really emotionally invested in gambling. I developed this very strong attachment and relationship with gambling. I loved gambling. I wanted to gamble. So it's something I wanted to do. After a few months, I won big. And I'm not going to mention the amounts because the amounts are all irrelevant really, but I won big, and for me it was the biggest amount of money I'd ever won. I remember that day I won loads of money. I felt very powerful. I was filled with confidence. I felt powerful. It was wonderful to go from having no money to having all this money, all these options, all these choices. It was wonderful. And what happened next is quite typical for any experience of people who gamble. I ended up winning all that money, but that just fueled my want to gamble even more. And so within a couple of months of having won all that money, I lost all that money and more. It's a classic tale. It's very typical of someone who has gambling problems. And that put my head in a bit of a spin. I couldn't cope with the fact that for one moment, a couple of months previous, I had all this money, and now I don't have any money. That put me into like a depression almost, like what has happened here almost. And I didn't cope with that at all. And I pretty much just abandoned ship. I couldn't cope with the feelings and the emotions that came up for me. And so I decided then to quit my home and quit my job. The reason why I made myself jobless and homeless was because I bought into this dream of travelling around Europe. So what I'd done is I booked my ticket across to Europe, and quit my home, quit my job, and I went to Europe. I booked a ferry from Harwich to Hook of Holland, and my dream was to arrive in Holland and find work, during the summer, do what any young lad would want to do, just go travelling. And that's what I wanted to do. But what happened was I got onto the boat at Harwich, and there was a roulette table there, and by the time I got to Hook of Holland, I'd gambled all of my money by about €60. And I'll always remember that day. That was another significant experience for me, because I think, you know, I remember looking out the window towards the Hook of Holland and thinking, what have I just done? You know, I've just gambled all my money away. I've quit my home, I've quit my job, and I'm arriving in a foreign country. I don't know any Dutch, you know, and I've got 60 euros. And the dread, the panic that set in, you know, it was a horrendous experience. After a couple of weeks of sleeping rough in Holland, in Leiden and Amsterdam, I ended up approaching the British Embassy in Amsterdam, and I told them my story. I told them what had happened, and they gave me just enough money to get back to the UK. And this was in like January, February, a few years back. And so I arrived back in the UK. I'm faced with the prospect of being homeless and street homeless in London. I'd just been homeless in London on a few occasions. I didn't fancy that prospect. And so the bus stopped off at Canterbury in Kent. So I'm thinking, why not? So I decided to get off at Canterbury in Kent. And so that was the mark of a new chapter for me, really. So I get off, it's cold, it's dark, it's miserable, and I'm homeless. And like a lot of big cities, Canterbury was and probably still is quite set up with a lot of homelessness provision. So I managed to find a local day centre, and that's where my drinking began to really accelerate. I began to drink with other people who evidently had chronic alcohol problems, and within a matter of weeks I drank so heavily that I developed an alcohol dependence myself. I'd also became aware of my gambling, and I became motivated to do something to address my gambling, but I didn't really know where to turn to. This was in 2002. Back in 2002, there's hardly any help for gambling at all. It was gambling addiction was not really recognised. There's no sector in the country that really acknowledged gambling or were interested in acknowledging gambling as a problem. I remember a conversation I had with a drug and alcohol worker in a homeless centre, and I told her about my gambling problem, and it was almost as if it had landed in a way that they really didn't understand or know about gambling addiction. So to me that told me that actually gambling addiction is not recognised. This was back in 2002. So the point I want to try and make here, through recognising I wanted to seek help for my gambling and having developed an alcohol dependency, I ended up having to approach an NHS service specifically focusing on people who had alcohol problems. So I made a referral and I went to this alcohol service, and this was my first ever experience of stepping into a treatment organisation. And I remember being sat down in front of a therapist for the first time, and I remember having a conversation and crying, and the realisation dawned on me that I am an addict. You know, I have addiction problems. You know, I have an alcohol problem, I have a serious gambling problem. So it was at that moment, at 20 years old, 19, 20 years old, and that realisation that I had addiction problems, and that if I am to have some kind of future, I need to address both my alcohol and my gambling. Otherwise, my future, the dream I have of having a good life, is going to be really undermined. So yeah, that was the start of a very long journey of trying to deal with my addictions. So I've always had the motivation to want more and do better. That motivation has always been there. However, the reality of achieving what I wanted it really proved really hard work. So from that moment, when I was 19, 20 years old, you know, sat in the therapist chair for the first time, it took me a good eight or so years to get to a place where I could arrive at a place in my life where I was able to get a sense for the first time of living a life without my addictions. I just want to talk about gambling because, you know, whilst I was able to address my alcoholism very quickly and get to a stage where I was not drinking, which lasted for a good number of years, which was amazing, gambling stuck. And I always reflect on why that was. My relationship with gambling, I had a very strong relationship with gambling. I loved gambling. I had a very strong emotional attachment to gambling. Gambling defined who I was. I allowed gambling to define who I was. I was Owen who gambled. And in my efforts to try and stop gambling, it was really, really hard work. First of all, I just didn't know how to stop. I couldn't stop. Despite all my will, I just could not stop gambling. Now, when I think about my relationship with gambling, it gave me a sense of self. It defined who I was. It gave me a sense of purpose. Gambling gave me a sense of direction in life. It is what I did. Gambling also gave me hope. So gambling for me, my relationship with gambling provided me with a lot of my needs, my physical needs, my financial needs, my emotional needs. So it was a very, very perverse relationship. And so yeah, going back to the comment I made about trying to quit gambling, when I did have experiences of not gambling, whether it be for a weekend or a week, that my life completely felt empty and void. And so the allure to go and gamble even more was very, very strong, because it was the only thing that gave me hope at the time. You know, with gambling, unlike with all the drugs, you know, I knew I could go into a bookmaker's or a gaming centre, you know, with a couple of quid, and I could win a few £100, and that was so strong. That was such an attractive prospect for me to continue to gamble. But what it did was it just compounded my situation even more. I was not in a great situation anyway. I'd arrived in Canterbury homeless, and I was accessing homeless centres all the time. So my situation was not good, but by keeping that relationship with gambling, I was just compounding the situation, because as much as I fantasized about continuing to gamble and dreaming big, the reality was I was not winning big. I was not able to capture or recapture the big win I had, you know, at 18. And all I was doing was just losing all my money. After several years of trying to address my gambling, after a couple of relapses on alcohol and messing around with other drugs, it got to a place where I just felt really, really completely and utterly exhausted. I'd exhausted all the resources that there were in the community. By this time, I'd gone through treatment 2 or 3 times. I'd used NA and AA a few times, but I was completely on my knees. I had no energy left to fight for my recovery. I was exhausted. I was drained. So the time came for me to go to rehab. So I made an application to go to rehab, and so within a few weeks, I arrived at the doors of a rehab. And so for me, that was a big change, a big shift in terms of my experience, of my approach in terms of dealing with my addiction. I felt I was able to learn more things in the lay community than I could have learned in the community. It was difficult because I had to come to terms with some harsh home truths about myself and the person who I'd become. You know, I'd experienced so much trauma and adversity in my life up until that point, and what I realised had taken place, I had developed ways of coping in being which just was not conducive in normal society. I became really defensive, really paranoid, really obnoxious. Any perceived threat of being attacked, you know, I would retaliate in such an unhealthy and unhelpful kind of way. And my experience, my time in the elite held up a mirror. Very cliche, but it held up a mirror, and I realised actually, you know, the person who I'd become, the traits that I developed, the way I handled and coped with people, just was something needed to shift. And so, with the lead holding up a mirror towards me, I was able to see those very things that I needed to change about myself. And so there, I realised that in order for me to achieve what I wanted to achieve in recovery, a good life, not only did I needed to address my alcohol and gambling, but I needed to change some fundamental parts of myself and my character. Okay, so I became motivated to become a better person. I began to accept actually I need to make some fundamental shifts, and so there was an opportunity in the league for me to practice new ways of being and new ways of responding to perceived slights, perceived threats, and all that kind of stuff. So I realised there and then, actually, I need to work on myself and improve my relationships with people, because up until that point I had a history, I had a tendency to destroy all my relationships. I had a track record of failed, destroyed relationships, and that didn't sit well with my conscience. I realised I needed to do something really, really differently. So a lot of seeds, very cliche, but a lot of seeds were planted for me during my time in the Lee, and I've gone on to subsequently build on those seeds. And I've always aspired to work out how I can better relate to people, and be healthier in relationships, develop healthier ways of being, you know. When I left the Lee, I still hadn't really found a way of addressing my gambling. So after the Lee, I went to a dedicated gambling clinic through the NHS, and it was only through engaging in group CBT there where I was able to, for the first time in 11 years of trying to engage in addiction services, where I was able to get to a place where I could actually stop gambling and stay stopped for a significant period of time. And I suppose reflecting back on the group CBT, it was bespoke, and it was tailored towards my particular needs as someone who had a gambling addiction. So I was really receptive to that experience. And so for the first time ever, I was able to get to a stage in my life, in my recovery, where I was able to experience life without gambling. And this was a completely new and unfamiliar experience for me, and it was a wonderful experience. And for the first time ever, I felt and believed I could live a life without gambling. And it was the first time I'd experienced rebuilding my life without gambling. Is a really important experience for me. Given that this was my first time I'd ever addressed the gambling and the alcohol, other challenges began to surface, which I wasn't aware of at the time because I was so consumed and concerned with my gambling. And fundamentally, I think, and this was highlighted in my experience of the Lee, my issues around relationships came up for me time and time again, and I realised that even in a romantic context, I struggled to hold a romantic relationship, and on a couple of occasions those relationships broke down, and I remember being totally broken, totally overwhelmed with the fear of abandonment and rejection. And these experiences led to cataclysmic relapses on alcohol and gambling again. So there's something about my experience of trying to find a partner that I needed to look at, and that hit something really deep within me, which I needed to kind of like sort out. And so yeah, I realised that I had, by dealing with my gambling and my experience of romantic relationships, I realised I had some serious issues around attachment and abandonment, which I needed to work on. So this was an area which I began to work on, and I realised I needed to do some further healing in that particular area. I want to give reference back to when I was 10 or 11 years old. When I think back to the young Owen then, I realise now how dangerous and how threatening relationships were, and how much I avoided relationships, and how much I sought self-soothing and comfort and solace through all the addictive behaviours, all the behaviours that became addictive through petty stealing, through alcohol, through gambling, through drugs. So I realise now that actually I need to face head-on the challenges and the issues I have in relationships of all types. So I was trying to find, not only was I trying to address and resolve those things about me that were toxic and unhelpful in relationships, I was also trying to find the courage and confidence to being able to take some risks in my relationships in order to try and confront those fears I had, in order to try and overcome those, so I can allow healthier relationships into my life and keep those relationships, maintain those relationships, nurture those relationships instead of destroying those relationships. So I knew fundamentally that developing that capacity within myself to form healthy and maintain healthy relationships was key, was very essential to my recovery. My experience of romantic relationships were different, because I think that tapped into a very deep part of me that clearly, evidently, was not healed or dealt with. And I'm still dealing with that to this very, very day. I've had a recent experience over the past couple of years where I believe a couple of years ago I experienced what I believe was requited love. And for me to experience that, that was the most beautifully potent experience I've ever had. To experience a bond and a connection with another person on that level. Unfortunately, that experience of requited love turned into a complete paralyzing obsession, whereby I could not think about anything else. I could not do anything else other than think about this person. And so what I thought was requited love turned into an obsession, and that degree of obsession was something I'd never experienced before through drugs, through alcohol, through gambling. It was an obsession which was just unrelenting, and I experienced complete and utter paralysis. I remember sitting at my desk and just observing the degree, the acuity of the obsession. I'm just thinking, I'm just completely and utterly flawed. I cannot do anything with this obsession. I'm just sat here, and I'm just, from the moment I get up to the last thing at night, I cannot think about this person. I cannot do anything other than think about this person. Where that led me to was a realization that actually there are some fundamental parts of me which I need to look at further, in terms of old abandonment wounds, in terms of my attachment to people and things and behaviors. And actually, I need to spend my time and energy on healing those areas. So I'm very grateful for that experience of what I think was requited love, because what it's done, it's brought me to a place where I have a closer relationship with myself. And that's proved to be a very, very painful place to be, because I am squarely facing a lot of my trauma and a lot of old wounds which I've not healed from to this day. But whilst it's a very painful journey I'm on, I know it's the right path I'm on. I know it's the right place for me to be, and it's a place where I've avoided for so many years in my recovery from gambling. I thought wrongly that if I address my gambling and my alcohol, I'm going to be in recovery and I'm going to live happily ever after. That is not my truth anymore. I realise that practicing the skills to stop my gambling and drinking was just perhaps one of the first big steps in my efforts to get into recovery and build my life away from gambling. And what it's done is it's allowed me to, dealing with those things, it's allowed me to have the capacity to actually experience intimacy, a level of intimacy which I've never experienced before. But by having that experience of intimacy with a woman, it's brought me closer to areas which I need to work on even more. And to experience that love obsession, it's just helped me. It's really helped me. It's really influenced how I viewed my experience of addiction. Ultimately, I think I've arrived at a place whereby I realise that in order for me to move forward, I need to practice building and strengthening that relationship I have with myself. I'm talking about self-love, I'm talking about self-compassion, self-forgiveness, self. Because I believe that's where my focus needs to lie, relationship with self. I realise I've been self-abandoning myself, and seeking comfort and solace through things externally, through alcohol, through gambling, through drugs, and avoiding relationships. But now I realise that the opposite is true for me. I need to abandon all of these ways I've been self-soothing and escaping through the drugs, the alcohol and the gambling. And actually, the solution is through what I originally feared when I was a young person. The solution for me is to overcome my fears around closeness with other people, and learn how to be okay and comfortable with having people in my life, learning how to connect with others, and practicing that, and becoming good at that, mastering that skill of connecting with others, communicating with others, having good relationships with others, but critically developing that capacity to have a good and healthy relationship with myself. Because I say this because I realise now just how much I have abandoned myself and how much I have harmed myself through all these behaviours, which I thought were serving me well, but actually these behaviours have just done nothing but destroy myself. I view these behaviours through a totally different lens now, and I realise that there's no room for these behaviours because they now don't serve me well. They're not healing. They're not helpful in any way. Quite the contrary. They're damaging. They're harmful. They're destructive. They're toxic. And so, through the lens of self-love, if I assume that I have self-love and I'm practicing self-love, why would I want to engage in a behaviour that is contrary to that value that I have? So therefore, I try to move forward in my daily life. I try to move forward in ways and act and behave in ways that align with my values of self-love and self-compassion and connection with others. And for me, I think that's central for me nowadays. And that's a polar shift compared to how I was when I was a 10 or 11-year-old boy. Now I'm embracing relationships. Now I'm embracing the relationship I have with myself. And it is really, really hard work. It's easy to love someone. I found it easier to love someone else or something else, for example, a dog, than it is to love with myself. And I realise practicing self-love and compassion, it's a daily practice, it's a daily effort, and I'm not consistent with it, but I'm trying to practice it as much as I can, because without a healthy relationship I have with myself, my recovery is not as rich as it could be, really. So that's where I'm at in my recovery at the moment, a realisation that I need to practice being more loving and kind towards myself. So I just want to take us back to the time about 13 years ago where I had for the first time the experience of not gambling and being able to stay stopped for quite a time. At the time, I was really angry towards these gambling terminals that appeared in bookmakers. They call them fixed odds betting terminals, FOBTs, and these FOBTs had roulette on them. They still have roulette on them today, but I was really angry at the time because these machines were introduced illegally, but they were made legal through the 2005 Gambling Act. It's a long story, but I felt really, really angry towards these, and because I'd personally experienced a substantial amount of harms through these machines, and I knew a lot of people who'd been really affected by these machines as well. And because I was doing really, really well, I felt really passionate. I felt a huge amount of fire and motivation to actually do something with this experience. And so I reached out to a couple of academics that I knew who specialised in gambling, and they showed me that there was a couple of campaign groups that had appeared that were very vocal towards these machines. So I got in touch with these campaign groups, and that for me was the start of my involvement in the gambling sector. So that was like 14 years ago, and that led me onto a path of going to lots of gambling conferences and events and networking and listening to all the gambling experts in the field. And I felt confident enough to be able to put my head above the parapet and share my story, because I felt so strongly about these machines and the harm they was causing, and I wanted to do something with my experience. So I felt almost like a moral obligation almost to do something with my experience and raise awareness, because at the time there was very few people who were raising awareness, and societal attitude towards gambling addiction was not particularly great. There's lots of stigma associated with gambling, and I wanted to do my bit, you know. That led me onto a path of being involved in the gambling sector, and I've been involved with the gambling sector ever since. There's a lot I could say about it, but over the years I have done a lot to use my experience. I've been able to leverage my experience to influence policy, regulation, research. I've spoken at the House of Lords. I've spoken at various gambling conferences and events. I've helped many people along the way of being able to help their gambling addiction. I've spoken to a lot of organisations to raise awareness of gambling harms within their teams as well. And I have been involved in setting up a number of organisations that are peer focused, lived experience focused. What I mean by that is I probably haven't explained that very well. People who, like me, who have had gambling problems, who like me, want to do something with their lived experience, but also have the desire to do something in terms of setting up some kind of entity, some kind of organisation. I've been able to help them people set up a number of organisations. And more recently, I've been involved with the commissioning of the NHS gambling services. We now have a network of NHS gambling services serving the whole of England. I was involved in the commissioning of those services. I'm a gambling peer support worker working at the National Gambling Clinic, and more recently, as the NHS England Gambling Harms Network clinics mobilise, we now have a small team of peer support workers working in each of these respective services, and I'll now chair that team of lived experience workers supporting the NHS Gambling Network. So yeah, I'm in a position where I can use my experience, my lived experience of gambling harms, but having combined that with all the experience I've gained and all the insights I've gained of being involved in the gambling sector for the past 13 years, I'm able to bring all that together and actually do something and channel that into something really, really positive. This has been an amazing journey, being involved in the gambling sector for 13 years, because what it's done, it's given me a sense of purpose, a sense of direction. Having messed up in school, having left school with no qualifications, being involved in the gambling sector, the insights I've had, the exposure I've had to a range of academic disciplines, from politics through to media, through to research, through to business, through to entrepreneurship. You know, I have the opportunity to learn about all of these areas, and so in many ways I feel as though I'm making up for my lost and messed up education. You know, I'm learning on the job. I'm continuously learning and educating myself in all of these different areas, and I find it just really fascinating and really engaging. I'm learning a hell of a lot. Not only am I in a strong position to influence systems, I'm also helping people directly, but I'm also helping the new people with lived experience of gambling harms coming into the sector. I'm able to help those, help develop those. How can I say it? I'm also in a position where I'm able to enable their learning and growth in this space too. So I feel really enriched, really, in terms of what I'm doing professionally, and it kind of like validates all the past experience I've had. My hopes for the future. My circumstances aren't great at the moment, but the way I would like to see myself in, say, 2 years' time, 5 years' time, I would like a home for myself. You know, I'd like to have my own home. I'm not talking about a mortgage or anything like that, just my own space, because I live in shared housing at the moment. So it'd be wonderful to have my own space. I like to be in a relationship. It'd be nice to have a family. I'm not there yet. So there is some kind of paternal drive and wishes within me, absolutely, for sure. But I think fundamentally what's important is for me to have and keep good, healthy relationships in my life. The connection with others is so really important to me nowadays. You know, I don't want to have lots of friends as such, but I think, you know, I just want to be a good person, and I want to do good in the world. I want to be good. I want to be a positive person in this world. I want to bring value. I want to be healthy in this space, you know. And also, you know, I see my career as being a really big part of my future as well, because there's some really exciting things there, and I've found the confidence to know that actually I've got a huge amount of value I can bring to my career as well. And I just want to achieve a level of security, you know, health security, financial security, emotional security, because I've not really had much of that, and it'd be nice to arrive in a place where I can feel and be more secure as well.